All right. So we're gonna tackle a big question here that a lot of folks are wondering. We meet with people in the conference room and have this discussion a lot. And the question is, does the sequence of returns matter when it comes to retirement planning? So let's just talk about sequence of returns first. Let's say, for example, you have a 5-year period where the market goes up 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%, and then the last year down 40%. Is it better to have that down 40% year up front and then 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%? So the sequence, what these market returns do, what kind of impact do they have on your investments?
Yeah, it feels like something that people are very concerned about, especially when they're trying to figure out the exact timing of retirement. We see this concern with people when it's November and they're retiring in January. It's what happens if the market tanks in 2025? That's going to set my retirement off on a bad trajectory. And sequence of returns, I think, definitely is important. It's something that's out of our control, unfortunately, because we don't know when the market's going to have a bad year. We know that the market will have bad years, but we can't tell you if it's going to be in the first year of your retirement or the 4th year of your retirement or the 10th year of your retirement. I think the important thing is having the discussion with people to build a plan and a portfolio and retirement income planning and things that are insulated from the bad years in the market and making sure that you can survive them.
To give another illustration of this sequence of returns, I had this conversation with several people a few years back, and you guys, I'm sure, remember hearing me say this to people. What if I told you that over the last 3 years, someone calls up, they're unhappy with the way things are going with their investments or with the market overall, and I would say, what if I told you over the last 3 years, we would average 10%? And of course, they're sensitive to that because they didn't make any money at that point in the year, or they might have been down. They would have been like, 10% is great. And I'm like, okay, here's the terms. First year, you make 30%. The next 2 years, you make nothing. You're going to average 10% a year. Still okay with this? And I think that's when you give people illustrations that way, they seem to get it, that you can't bank on year-to-year numbers. I think the long-term historical return for the last 20 or 30 years is something over 9% for stocks, but there's very rarely been a single year that has returned exactly 9% or whatever the historical number is.
I think it was like 4 or 5 years since 1950 where the market has even returned 7, 8, or 9%. I think it was Ryan Dietrich with Carson who did the study. And I think
he's a great follow on Twitter, by the way.
Yeah, I think he did. He even wanted to build in some wiggle room there of 1% either way, 1% around the average. I think it was 4 or 5 times since 1950. So I think that's a discussion that we have with a lot of people too, is we use average returns in our retirement plans, and
there's nothing average about it.
We don't want to bank on that. We have to assume something for market returns moving forward. But I think something that is important for us to stress to folks is if we do have a good year, like we have, 23 was a good year, 24 was a good year where we have above average market returns, does that mean that we can draw the accounts down more, or how do we handle or address that question usually, Tim?
No, I'm just kidding. But you don't want to do something like that, in my opinion, just because if you think of it in terms of the flip side of that, it's if you take more out when the market is doing really well and you're overperforming, does that mean that you have to live on less when the market is down?
You have to.
But that doesn't necessarily flesh out in the real world. People still have to pay their bills and their costs are what they are. Sure, there might be some areas of the budget where they might be able to scale back if things are not doing so hot in the market, but let's put some numbers to this. If you had drawn up a plan for someone and said, hey, we're going to take out $3,000 a month or 36 grand a year, but in a good year, we're going to take 50. In a poor year in the market, we're going to actually take out 18,000. How do you tell someone to live on less when their whole plan was, okay, I'm getting 3 grand a month, 36 grand a year? You can't.
Yeah.
I don't think you can.
Yeah, I don't think it's realistic. I think on paper, it might make sense in your head, but in realistic application of everyday life, I don't think it works that way. They're going to live on, their costs are going to be the same whether the market's up or down. I think keeping it in check when the market's going up and not spending more, those extra gains that you get in those years is what helps you be able to survive the down years. If you're taking out all of the excess gains every year when the market's up and then the market goes down, like we're saying, you're not going to live on less. It's just not going to happen. So I don't think it's realistic to take out more when the market's up and take out less when the market's down. I think, like you said earlier, what the market gives us on a year-to-year basis is out of our control. But there are a couple of things that we can do that are within our control ahead of time. I think one is taking the appropriate amount of risk and maintaining that through up markets, down markets, sideways markets, just taking the right amount of risk so we don't freak out when the market's dropping and we don't feel like we're missing out when markets are going higher. And the second is maintaining an appropriate cash level in your bank account. And that could be cash in your actual bank account or short-term investments where we have 1, 2, 3 years of expenses earmarked in something short-term, something stable that's going to be there when we need it. And I think the idea with that is it allows you to ride out down markets knowing that you have those expenses banked and not swinging around when markets get volatile.
I agree 100%. Think that having a proper allocation saves a lot of folks from needing to have this discussion in the future. And so if we put together a portfolio for someone that is say 70-30, we're only going to have 70% of the investable assets in their accounts in the market at risk with the potential for growth at any time. We're going to have 30% tucked away in something that's a little, hopefully less volatile, something safer that they can draw on in the event that they do need to tap into their account. So the asset allocation is, I think, it fixes this conversation in the sense that you don't have to worry as much about the sequence of returns if you've got things properly allocated. I'll also just add a conversation that I had recently with an organization that we manage money for. But they pointed out at a recent meeting, they said over the last 2 years, we've made $400,000 in this account. I think that the way it was posed to me was not really a question, but a statement. They said, we want to change the investments to protect our gains. And you guys have heard this story already, but for our viewers at home, the response was absolutely not. We're not going to be changing things because we have an allocation set up for you so that if we do need to tap into these accounts, we do have, in this particular case, 40% of the assets sitting in some super safe stuff. So we can allow the growth side of the market to go up, down, sideways for the next 2 years, next 3 years, without needing to tap into that side or make changes on that side of things. So allocation, I think, is really important.
It's really hard to do, but I think it's important to not let what the market has done recently affect the amount of risk that you want to take in the account. That should be fairly consistent across longer time horizons, which we're usually investing for. And I think it works both ways. It works in up markets. You don't want to take too much risk because you feel like you're missing out. In down markets, you don't want to protect your losses just because or protect against losses just because the market's going down. I think that's going to lead to making really poor timing decisions. And yeah, if anything, it's usually the opposite strategy that works better. But a sequence of return is something that we can account for ahead of time. We don't know, like you said in the beginning, Tim, we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but there are ways that we can plan for and hopefully insulate you from, getting your retirement off on a poor start is something that we can hopefully plan for a little bit ahead of time. And at least make mentally a little bit easier to withstand. That's going to do it. That's all I got.
All right, cool. Great. Thanks, guys.